toughness, it's a very mental toughness is a very messy concept in the research. It's not it's not terribly useful, and the definitions are sort of all over the place. But if you distill it down, it means goal fixedness for the most part, which is a pretty narrow thing, which is that I have an objective and I'm not going to let anything keep me from that objective. And so if you're a high performing athlete, you're someone who's a business owner, you're an executive, you're whatever, you're a tough person, you work towards something without letting anything deter you. But as an isolated variable, toughness on its own is only helpful up to a certain point. There's kind of a bell curve, and you have to consider the other factors that are involved or the other personality traits that are involved with toughness.
Along the lines of what you were saying, it made me reflect. I was a competitive motocross racer. I was ranked, and I had a sponsorship from a Honda shop in our town that paid for pretty much all of my racing because I was good at it, and it was good marketing for them. But you can't race motocross without wiping out, and you get hurt. I've rehabilitated many of the greatest motocross racers in the world, and they're my clients. And one of them was recently on my podcast. The point I'm driving at, though, is, if you wipe out on a motocross bike when you're racing, if you're not dead, the goal is to get back on as quick as you can. Because if you, I have actually wiped out, been a half a lap behind, and come back to win races. So the point I'm driving at is if you have a specific target in mind, like a finish line, and you're not completely broken, like I've literally been completely unconscious, had people pick me up, throw water on me, wake me up, get me back on my bike, and I could still be competitive. And I think for me, part of it was just learning that being hurt doesn't mean you're out of the game if you can still control your motorcycle. So my point is, I think having a real definite target and knowing the difference between being incapacitated and just being, maybe cut up and bruised up or knocked and dazed, or even having a broken rib, I can still race a motocross bike with a broken rib. It's just super hard to breathe, but you can still do it. Point being, I think having a target is very important so that you know what your objective is, and there's a possible point at which you can say, okay, I've hit the finish line here, so I don't need to do this for 20 days in a row.
Yeah. And to be able to objectively evaluate, that difference between hurt and harm. Like you're in pain, but is anything structurally broken? Like, do you have a broken femur? Like, is this something that needs immediate attention right now, or can you set aside the discomfort for the sake of the objective that you currently have and move towards that?
Yeah, personally, I think from my background in martial arts and boxing, kickboxing, and also a lot of my buddies are cage fighters and elite fighters and a lot of jiu-jitsu. I think for kids, I've got my son in martial arts. I think real proper, martial arts and jiu-jitsu and all those are really good development along the lines of everything we're talking about if they're properly run with a skilled coach. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up with you, because I think this is really important. I've worked with thousands of people that have destroyed themselves trying to be tough guys. And what advice do you have? I mean, I certainly have things I could say, but I'd like to hear yours. When you're doing this toughness training, whether it be internal toughness or physical toughness, you could be out doing long ruck marches. You could be doing triathlon training, swimming, whatever it is. There's also not a lot of people know where the line is between when they're just dealing with discomfort or something that'll heal and when they're actually damaging themselves. For example, I've worked with countless athletes that push themselves into stress fractures and had their fourth and fifth metatarsal or their tibia stress fracture, and that puts them out sometimes for 4, 5, 6 months, depending on their nutritional profile and how well they listen to the therapist. So, what tips would you give somebody for knowing where the line is between being a tough guy and being an idiot?
Short answer is metabolic stress versus structural stress, knowing to distinguish between the two. The longer answer involves the definition of toughness or mental toughness specifically, and why tough people are more predisposed to those kinds of injuries. Because toughness, it's a very mental toughness is a very messy concept in the research. It's not it's not terribly useful, and the definitions are sort of all over the place. But if you distill it down, it means goal fixedness for the most part, which is a pretty narrow thing, which is that I have an objective and I'm not going to let anything keep me from that objective. And so if you're a high performing athlete, you're someone who's a business owner, you're an executive, you're whatever, you're a tough person, you work towards something without letting anything deter you. But as an isolated variable, toughness on its own is only helpful up to a certain point. There's kind of a bell curve, and you have to consider the other factors that are involved or the other personality traits that are involved with toughness. I don't know if you caught this story. We open our book with it. Um, my buddy, the one actually who runs the sub 5 miles when he's in his 40s now, when he was a recon medic in the Marines, and he was supervising a sniper training exercise. So a bunch of guys who were crawling around in the grass trying to sneak towards an objective in the desert, like get up close to a target, and then they'd either make a shot or they just report they'd be able to see something like a little number that they had to be close enough to see without being seen. And we'll call him Doc. He gave his med brief before this exercise started. They're in the desert in California in tall grass, and he went through all the usual, like, these are the things that can go wrong. You're familiar with these, like, this is what can go wrong, this is what you do if it does. And one of the last things he said was, and there's a lot of snakes out here, so if you get bitten by a snake, try to keep the snake. That way they can know if it was venomous and what type of antivenom they'll need to treat it. And Doc is sitting there in a truck, like, kind of just glassing the field or watching the field that all these sniper students are crawling around in. And he sees this guy jump up out of the grass, throw his arms over his head, kind of like he's doing a burpee, and then just slam back down to the ground and disappear back into the grass. And he's sitting there puzzling over this, trying to figure out what's just happened. And he gets a call over the radio from one of the instructors that ran up to it. And they tell him that they need him right now, and he needs to go treat 11 snake bites. And he thinks that
Whoa.
somehow the entire like sniper team got bit by snakes and there's 11 different guys, but no, it was one guy with 11 snake bites. And so this was a very mentally tough scout sniper student who had one objective in his mind, and that was he's going to skull drag or crawl his way to this target without being seen. And he's crawling along and he heard a rattle, and he looked up and focused his eyes fairly close in front of him, and there was a really big timber rattlesnake that was coiled up and facing him. And just as he looked up at it, his one arm was up in front of his head while he was low crawling, and it bit him and popped him on the arm. And so now this guy who has one primary objective, which was complete the stalk, like make it to the target without being seen, he now has another objective, which is you have to keep the snake because Doc said keep the snake. And as you know, like the medics in the military, especially in infantry units or combat units, are sort of like voodoo shamans. Like people just do whatever they say and they don't really question it. So this guy was going to absolutely do what he was told to do. Without being seen, he was going to get this snake so he could keep it and bring it to Doc and deal with it because he figured he could finish the stock fast enough that he'd maybe be okay. And so as soon as it popped him on the arm, he reached out and tried to grab it with his other arm, got bit on the top of the hand, I think, and proceeded into basically a fist fight with a rattlesnake laying down in the grass.
Bad
And got
idea.
got bit repeatedly. Like the snake worked his way up, popped him on the shoulder, popped him on the top of the head, and then finally he latched onto it and was wrestling with it. And the snake gave up and tried to crawl away. As it was getting away, he grabbed it by the tail and jumped. This is what Doc saw. He jumped up on his feet, threw the snake over his head, and slammed the snake down on the ground and hit its head on a rock and killed it. And then collapsed down into the grass and thought he was going to finish his stalk and carry his pet snake with him so that he could give it to Doc. But instead, he started blacking out. And that was about when the instructors saw him or ran up on him and they got Doc. And like most people, when they heard that instruction, if you get bit by a snake, try to keep the snake would put that in context. Like try to pin it down with the butt of your rifle or shoot it from a safe distance with a pistol or something. Do something safe that allows us to keep the snake so we can identify it. This guy skipped all of that and just went straight to the I will get the snake at all costs, even if it means a fight to the death under the grass. And as they were loading this guy into the ambulance, he was mostly unconscious, but he could still kind of talk and see shapes and hear sounds. He was still holding his rattlesnake and he would not give it up because his objective was to keep the snake. And Doc told him to keep the snake. So he had to like hold his face in his hands and tell him, "You're done. You did a good job. The mission is over. You got the snake. You kept the snake. You can let it go now." And he finally let it go. But but that's an example of what mental toughness without any other context really is. It's this irrational goal fixedness where if you have it to an extreme degree, like clearly this sniper was a very tough person, but you don't combine that with cognitive flexibility or the capacity to reappraise and adapt to a changing situation, then mental toughness can push you into a really dangerous or problematic scenario. And that happens with a lot of athletes where they're going to follow this training plan no matter what happens, no matter how bad their shin hurts, no matter what's going on with their shoulder, they're just going to keep pushing forward without reassessing and adapting and changing course. And that's where we get some of these overuse injuries, the stress injuries, like tissue or stress fractures and things like that from pushing into something because you're tough and that seems like the thing to do instead of adapting. So toughness needs to be balanced with other things.
Like common sense.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah, it's rare, but it's definitely necessary.